state told you today that you would see three things: a young daughter, an enraged father, and a loaded gun. You haven't seen a gun. Another thing you haven't seen is a murderer. If you listen closely, even to the state's arguments, you hear that it all boils down to a protective but unstable father. As unstable as Mr. Draft may be, we do not concede that it was him who was responsible for the death of Stephen Walker, and neither should you. Because the state has failed to produce a single piece of physical evidence indicating that John Draft was anywhere near Stephen Walker's home at the time of his death. The best we've seen in that regard are some bullet casings found by Dusty Stockard. But ladies and gentlemen, evidence that the defendant may have fired a gun is not evidence that the defendant is a killer. You've heard from a lot of witnesses today, but only one was at the scene. Only one worked with the police. As an employee of the state and working with the Sheriff's Department, Dusty Stockard had ample opportunity to find a weapon, to conduct GSR tests, to conduct fingerprints, to conduct DNA, to interview all of the witnesses and people involved, including John Draft's own daughter, Sally. You heard from Dusty Stockard, he did none of those things. And what's more, there's a letter for you to consider in which Dusty Stockard failed to follow up on leads, legitimate leads, that did not involve John Draft. We also heard from Dr. Ciccone. Dr. Ciccone had a few conclusions for you, but one of them was that whoever saw those Twitter messages for you to review would have been very angry. Right after that, Dr. Ciccone told you that whoever shot Stephen Walker was calm and collected. It is these contradictions, this lack of evidence, that you must consider when you consider that the state had a very high burden today. It is upon them to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest burden in our entire legal system, that John Draft knowingly killed Stephen Walker. And in an effort to meet that burden, the state has presented you with testimony from a detective, not even a detective, someone who's not a police officer, working for the state's attorney's office and dating the defendant's ex-wife, and a psychiatrist who has never evaluated a defendant in this capacity before in his life. Even though the state has failed to meet their burden today, the evidence has shown that John Draft is a man in need of help. When presented with a threat on his daughter, he's shown that he simply cannot appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. For that finding, we as a defense carry the burden by a preponderance of the evidence, the lowest burden in our legal system. Meaning that if you find it more likely than not that John Draft was unable to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, then you must find him not guilty by reason of insanity. Let's consider the evidence that the state has presented you with regard to that low burden. You heard from Dusty Stockard, and how Dusty Stockard called John Draft from the scene, and how John Draft was speaking nonsense, not making sense, didn't know what was going on. The state brought forth Dr. Ciccone to explain to you that he's perfectly sane. But you heard, and you should consider, how these conclusions are based on minimal experience, minimal time with the defendant, and are contradicted by an expert in forensic psychiatry, Dr. Chris Johnson. And although it's Dr. Ciccone offering you opinions on the mental state of John Draft, it is Dr. Ciccone who has a belief that it is the work of a professional assassin behind the death of 22-year-old Armadillo resident Stephen Walker. Not to mention, you heard from John Draft, who told you that Dr. Ciccone is not to be trusted. And he told you that the events of May 13th, 2011, as he remembered them. How he is so protective of his daughters that upon seeing messages between her and an older man, he literally and physically fell ill, blacked out for 8 days. He also told you about his history of mental instability and breaks with reality. And it was Dr. Johnson who was able to confirm and tell you about that instability. Dr. Johnson is an expert in this very field of forensic psychiatry. She reviewed the exhibits. She interviewed the defendant for over 10 hours, and she reviewed all the testimony. She came to a conclusion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that John Draft is a mental disease or defect, a personality disorder, and that he could not conform his actions. All of this adds up to the likely conclusion that John Draft simply could not appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. Members of the jury, when our town is rocked by a tragedy, such as the death of Stephen Walker, we want justice, and we want it quickly. But in seeking justice too swiftly, it's easy to make mistakes. That's why we ask you to take the time to carefully consider the evidence, to truly ask yourself whether the state of Lone Star is justified in punishing John Draft for murder or even placing him on trial. That is why, when you return to your deliberations, you should select not guilty on your jury verdict sheet. Regardless of your feelings on guilt, should you find it more likely than not that John Draft is a man in need of help, a man who can't control his actions when provoked by a trigger like a threat on his daughter, then you should select not guilty by reason of insanity. Because while we all want to do justice for victims of crimes, we shouldn't be too swift in punishing.